On a bright Monday morning in September, Maya Johnson stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting her blue sweater for the third time. Her dark curly hair was neatly pulled back with a matching blue headband, and her brown eyes reflected a mix of nervousness and excitement. Today was her first day at Riverside High School, and the 14-year-old wanted everything to be perfect. In the kitchen downstairs, her father, Dr. Marcus Johnson, was already dressed in his crisp black suit. As the new principal of Riverside High School, he had arrived at the school 2 weeks earlier to begin his duties. However, he and Maya had made an unusual decision. They would keep their relationship a secret for the first semester. "Are you sure about this, Maya?" Dr. Johnson asked, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs across the counter to his daughter. "We don't have to keep it quiet that you're my daughter." Maya took a small bite of her breakfast and nodded confidently. "Yes, Dad. I want people to know me as just Maya first, not as the principal's daughter. I want to make friends and have teachers treat me normally." Her father understood. Throughout his career in education, he had seen how children of staff members were sometimes treated differently, either too favorably or too harshly. Maya was bright, hardworking, and deserved to be judged on her own merits. Mrs. Johnson, Maya's mother, was already at work at the local hospital where she served as a pediatrician. She had left a good luck note on the fridge, decorated with little hearts and stars. Maya smiled as she read it again. The drive to school was quiet, with father and daughter going over their plan one last time. They would arrive separately. Dr. Johnson first, as he always did, and Maya would take the bus that would drop her off 10 minutes later. At school, they would acknowledge each other only as principal and student if they passed in the halls. When Maya stepped off the bus, she took a deep breath. Riverside High School was bigger than her old school, with its red brick buildings and wide concrete steps leading to the main entrance. Students were flowing in through the front doors, laughing and chatting with their friends. Maya clutched her backpack straps and joined the stream of teenagers. Inside, she found the main office where a friendly secretary, Mrs. Garcia, was waiting to help new students. "You must be Maya Johnson," she said warmly, handing her a schedule and a map. Mrs. Garcia was one of the few staff members who knew Maya's connection to the new principal, but she'd acted perfectly natural. Maya's first 2 classes, mathematics and history, went smoothly. Her teachers were welcoming, and a girl named Sarah even invited her to sit together during history. By the time third period English came around, Maya was feeling more relaxed. That's when she met Mrs. Patricia Reynolds. The English teacher stood at the front of the classroom, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, and her thin-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. Unlike Maya's other teachers, Mrs. Reynolds didn't smile when Maya handed her the new student slip. "Another transfer student," Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice carrying a hint of disapproval. She looked at Maya's paperwork with narrowed eyes. "You were in advanced English at your previous school." "Yes, ma'am," Maya replied politely. "I maintained an A average." Mrs. Reynolds made a small hemph sound and pointed to an empty desk in the back corner. "We'll see if you can keep up with our standards here. Take your seat." As Maya walked to her desk, she could feel Mrs. Reynolds watching her. The teacher's tone had been different from how she greeted the white student who had arrived late just minutes after Maya. Throughout the class, Maya paid careful attention and took detailed notes as Mrs. Reynolds discussed their current novel study. When she raised her hand to answer a question about the book's themes, Mrs. Reynolds ignored her at first. When she finally acknowledged Maya's raised hand, the teacher's response to her correct answer was curt and dismissive. By the end of the class, Maya had a strange feeling in her stomach. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about Mrs. Reynolds' behavior felt wrong. As she packed up her books, she overheard 2 students whispering. "Did you see how Mrs. Reynolds treated the new girl?" one asked. "Yeah," the other replied. "She's always like that with certain students. My sister had her last year and said the same thing." Maya walked out of the classroom deep in thought. She hadn't expected everything to be perfect on her first day, but Mrs. Reynolds' behavior was troubling. Still, she decided to give it time. Maybe the teacher was just having a bad day, or maybe she was naturally strict with all new students. Little did Maya know, this was just the beginning of what would become a challenging and important chapter in both her life and the history of Riverside High School. 2 weeks had passed since Maya's first day at Riverside High School, and a clear pattern was emerging in Mrs. Reynolds' English class. The teacher's behavior toward Maya had grown worse with each passing day, though she was careful to mask her actions with a thin layer of professionalism. On this particular Tuesday morning, Maya sat in her usual corner seat, her completed homework neatly placed on her desk. She had spent extra time on her essay about To Kill a Mockingbird, knowing Mrs. Reynolds was especially critical of her work. Around her, other students were chatting quietly before class began. "Papers out for collection," Mrs. Reynolds announced as she walked into the classroom, her heels clicking against the floor. She moved between the rows, picking up essays from each student. When she reached Maya's desk, she picked up the paper between two fingers as if it might be dirty. Sarah, who sat next to Maya now, noticed and frowned. She had become Maya's closest friend in the class and had witnessed many such small incidents over the past weeks. During the lesson, Mrs. Reynolds wrote several quotes from the book on the whiteboard. "Can anyone explain the significance of this passage?" she asked, pointing to one of them. Maya raised her hand, as did two other students. Mrs. Reynolds called on Tommy, a white student who rarely participated. He stumbled through an incorrect answer. "Good try, Tommy. Anyone else?" Mrs. Reynolds smiled encouragingly. Maya's hand remained raised, but again, Mrs. Reynolds called on another student. Only when no one else volunteered did she finally turn to Maya with a look of resignation. "The passage shows how prejudice affects innocent people," Maya explained clearly. "It's when Scout realizes that injustice exists in her community, and some people are treated unfairly because of their race." Mrs. Reynolds' lips tightened. "That's a very simplified interpretation," she said coldly. "I would expect a more sophisticated analysis in an advanced class." Several students exchanged glances. Maya's answer had been spot on, and everyone knew it. Sarah gave Maya's arm a supportive squeeze under the desk. Later that day, when Mrs. Reynolds handed back their graded essays, Maya stared at her paper in disbelief. A C was marked in red at the top, along with numerous harsh comments about basic writing skills and lack of depth. During lunch break, Sarah asked to compare essays with Maya. Sarah had received an A for work that was notably similar in quality. In fact, Maya's essay had more detailed examples and clearer arguments. "This isn't fair," Sarah said, looking angry. "Your essay is really good, Maya. Mrs. Reynolds is being completely biased." Maya took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Maybe I should talk to her after class. Ask for feedback on how to improve." After lunch, Maya approached Mrs. Reynolds' desk while other students filed out. "Excuse me, Mrs. Reynolds. Could you help me understand what I could do better on my essay?" Mrs. Reynolds barely looked up from her papers. "The grade reflects your work. Perhaps advanced English is too challenging for you. Have you considered moving to regular English?" Maya felt her cheeks grow warm, but she kept her voice steady. "My previous school recommended advanced placement, and I'm doing well in all my other classes." "Well, this isn't your previous school," Mrs. Reynolds said sharply. "Standards are different here. Some students just aren't cut out for advanced coursework, and that's perfectly." She paused, a small smile forming, natural. The implied meaning behind her words was clear. Maya clutched her essay tighter, turned around, and walked out of the classroom with her head held high. In the hallway, she pulled out her phone and took a photo of her essay and grade. Then she opened her notes app and documented the conversation, just as she had been doing with all her interactions with Mrs. Reynolds. That evening at home, Maya sat at her desk, staring at her collection of documented incidents. She hadn't told her father about what was happening. She wanted to handle this on her own. But as she looked through her notes, she realized this wasn't just about unfair grades anymore. It was about something much bigger. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Check your email. I sent you recordings from today's class. Been keeping track too. This isn't right, Maya." Maya smiled slightly, feeling less alone. She hadn't asked anyone to help document what was happening, but her classmates had noticed the unfair treatment and had taken it upon themselves to gather evidence. They could see what Mrs. Reynolds was doing, and they weren't okay with it either. The situation was getting worse, but Maya was getting stronger, and she wasn't alone anymore. 1 month into the semester, the tension in Mrs. Reynolds' English class had reached a boiling point. The teacher had become bolder in her unfair treatment of Maya, seemingly encouraged by the fact that no one had officially challenged her behavior. On this particular morning, Maya was giving a presentation on her independent reading book. She had chosen That Her Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston and had prepared thoroughly for her talk. As she stood at the front of the classroom, several students had their phones partially hidden in their laps, ready to record, a practice that had become common during Maya's presentations. The main character, Jani, faces many obstacles because of who she is, Maya explained confidently, but she stays true to herself and... That's enough, Mrs. Reynolds interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. Your time is up. Sarah checked her phone timer and raised her hand. Actually, Mrs. Reynolds, Maya still has 3 minutes left. Everyone else got their full 10 minutes yesterday. Mrs. Reynolds' face reddened. I wasn't aware you were now teaching this class, Sarah. Maya's presentation lacks academic depth. We need to move on. Maya stood her ground, her hands steady as she held her notes. I'd like to finish my presentation, please. I haven't covered my analysis of the symbolic. Sit down, Mrs. Reynolds snapped. This is exactly what I mean about maintaining standards. Some students think they can just walk into an advanced class and expect special treatment. The room went completely silent. Several more phones emerged, now recording openly. In the back row, a student named Michael raised his hand. Mrs. Reynolds, he said firmly, you let Tommy talk for 15 minutes yesterday about a comic book, and you said it was fine to go over time for thoughtful analysis. Mrs. Reynolds slammed her hand on her desk. That's enough. The next person who questions my teaching methods will be sent to the principal's office. Maya gathered her presentation materials and walked back to her desk, her head held high despite the humiliation. As she sat down, she noticed something different. Nearly half the class was now openly glaring at Mrs. Reynolds. A few students had tears in their eyes. Others were typing furiously on their phones, documenting what had just happened. During lunch break, a group of students gathered around Maya's table. We've been collecting evidence, Sarah said, pulling out her phone. Not just me anymore. Half the class has videos, screenshots of unfair grades, and notes about what she says to you. Michael, who had spoken up in class, joined them. My older sister is studying law in college. She says what Mrs. Reynolds is doing is textbook discrimination. We can't let this continue. Maya felt overwhelmed by their support. Thank you, but I don't want anyone getting in trouble for helping me. We're getting in trouble for doing what's right? A girl named Rachel asked. Then let us get in trouble. This isn't just about you anymore, Maya. It's about what's right. After school, Maya sat in her room looking through the evidence her classmates had shared with her. There were dozens of video clips, photographs of graded papers showing the clear disparity in grading, and detailed notes from multiple students documenting Mrs. Reynolds' behavior. Her phone buzzed with a new message from Sarah. Tomorrow's the group presentation. Mrs. Reynolds put all the minority students in one group and called it random. We got it on video. Maybe it's time to do something. Maya stared at her phone for a long time. She had wanted to handle this quietly, to prove she could succeed despite Mrs. Reynolds' treatment. But this wasn't just about her anymore. If Mrs. Reynolds was treating her this way, how many other students had faced similar discrimination? How many more would face it if no one spoke up? She opened her laptop and began organizing all the evidence into a clear, chronological document. Videos, photos, grade comparisons, witness statements, everything. As she worked, more messages came in from classmates sharing additional documentation. Tomorrow would be the group presentations, and Maya had a feeling it would be a turning point. Mrs. Reynolds had grown increasingly careless in hiding her prejudice, and the entire class was now watching and recording. Something had to give. Maya saved her document and closed her laptop. Tomorrow would indeed be different, but not in the way Mrs. Reynolds expected. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were ready, and Maya was done being quiet. The day of the group presentations dawned with an unusual tension in the air. Maya's group was scheduled to present last, and Mrs. Reynolds had a satisfied smirk on her face as she called the groups one by one. She had deliberately separated the class by race, putting Maya and the other 3 minority students together, calling it a random selection. The first 3 groups presented their analysis of different aspects of To Kill a Mockingbird. Mrs. Reynolds was generous with her praise, especially to the group of her favorite students. Finally, it was time for Maya's group to present their section about racial injustice in the novel. Maya stood confidently at the front with her group mates. James, who was Asian American, Maria, who was Hispanic, and Devon, who was African American like Maya. They had worked extra hard, knowing they would face unfair scrutiny. Our presentation examines how Harper Lee portrays systemic racism through the trial of Tom Robinson. Maya began, her voice clear and strong. The classroom was silent, with several students holding their phones ready to record. 5 minutes into their well-researched presentation, Mrs. Reynolds interrupted. "This interpretation is completely wrong," she said sharply. "You're making everything about race when the book is about more than that." Maria stepped forward. "Actually, Mrs. Reynolds, we're using direct quotes from the novel to support our analysis. Are you questioning my expertise?" Mrs. Reynolds stood up, her face turning red. "I've been teaching this book for 20 years. Your group is trying to push some kind of agenda here." Devon held up his copy of the book. "Would you like us to read the quotes directly from the text? We can prove every point we're making." "Sit down, all of you," Mrs. Reynolds shouted. "This is exactly what I mean about lowering our standards. Some students just aren't capable of understanding complex literature without turning it into a political statement." The class gasped at her blatant racism. Sarah stood up from her desk. "Mrs. Reynolds, you're proving exactly what our classmates are presenting about prejudice and abuse of power." "Get out," Mrs. Reynolds pointed at Sarah. "Go to the principal's office right now." "I'll go with her," Michael announced, standing up. "And I'm taking my video recording of this entire incident with me." One by one, students began standing up. Some gathered their things, while others simply stood at their desks in silent protest. Maya and her group remained at the front of the room, their presentation materials still in hand. Mrs. Reynolds looked around in shock as half the class prepared to leave. "If you leave this room, you'll all fail this semester. I think we have enough evidence of discrimination to challenge any grade you give," Rachel called out from the back. She held up her phone. "I've been recording every class for the past month." Maya finally spoke up, her voice trembling slightly but determined. "Mrs. Reynolds, you've graded us unfairly, insulted us, interrupted our presentations, and shown clear bias in how you treat different students. We documented everything. How dare you accuse me of?" Mrs. Reynolds began, but stopped as more students stood up. "We're all witnesses," James added. "And we're not going to be silent anymore." The situation had reached its breaking point. More than half the class was now standing, many recording the scene on their phones. Maya's group remained dignified at the front of the room, their evidence-based presentation abandoned, but their point made more clearly than any analysis could have shown. "This is outrageous," Mrs. Reynolds sputtered. "I'm going to the principal right now. We'll see what Dr. Johnson has to say about this disruption." As Mrs. Reynolds stormed toward the door, Maya felt a strange sense of calm. Her father would indeed have something to say about this, but not in the way Mrs. Reynolds expected. The time for hiding her identity was over. Sarah caught Maya's eye and nodded encouragingly. The whole class had come together, standing up against injustice not just for Maya, but for what was right. As students began filing out of the classroom, many paused to show Maya their recordings and offer words of support. The breaking point had come, and there was no going back. Mrs. Reynolds was heading to the principal's office, unaware that she was about to face not just an authority figure, but the father of the very student she had been discriminating against for months. Mrs. Reynolds stormed down the hallway toward the principal's office, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. Behind her, a group of students followed at a distance, led by Maya and Sarah. The secretary, Mrs. Garcia, looked up in surprise as the angry teacher burst through the office door. "I need to see Dr. Johnson immediately," Mrs. Reynolds demanded. "I have a group of disruptive students who need to be disciplined." Mrs. Garcia glanced at Maya, who had just entered with her classmates, and pressed the intercom button. "Dr. Johnson, Mrs. Reynolds is here with some students. She says it's urgent." "Send them in," came the calm reply. Mrs. Reynolds marched into the principal's office, expecting to see Dr. Johnson already seated at his desk. Instead, he was standing by the window, his back turned to the door. She didn't wait for him to turn around before starting her complaint. "Dr. Johnson, I have a serious situation in my advanced English class. These students are challenging my teaching methods, making false accusations, and recording my classes without permission, particularly this student." She pointed at Maya, who stood quietly among her classmates. Dr. Johnson slowly turned around. "Which student, Mrs. Reynolds?" "This one." Mrs. Reynolds gestured dramatically at Maya again. "She's been causing trouble since she arrived. She clearly doesn't belong in advanced English, and now she's turned the whole class against me with ridiculous accusations of discrimination." "I see," Dr. Johnson said calmly. "And what exactly are these accusations?" Sarah stepped forward, phone in hand. "We have videos, Dr. Johnson. Mrs. Reynolds has been treating Maya unfairly since day one. She grades her work differently, interrupts her presentations, and makes racist comments." "This is absurd," Mrs. Reynolds exclaimed. "Dr. Johnson, you don't understand. This girl—" "Maya Johnson," Dr. Johnson interrupted, his voice still calm but firm. "Her name is Maya Johnson." Mrs. Reynolds froze. She looked at Maya, then at Dr. Johnson, her face slowly draining of color as realization dawned. "Johnson?" she whispered. "Yes, Mrs. Reynolds," Dr. Johnson said, walking around his desk. "Maya is my daughter. I've been aware of the situation in your classroom for some time, but Maya wanted to handle it on her own. It seems she and her classmates have done exactly that." The silence in the office was deafening. Mrs. Reynolds sank into a chair, her face ashen. The students watched as their teacher's arrogance crumbled before their eyes. I didn't know," Mrs. Reynolds stammered. "I never meant." "You never meant for the principal to find out you were discriminating against his daughter?" Michael asked. "Or you never meant for anyone to notice you treat students differently based on their race?" Dr. Johnson raised his hand for silence. "This situation goes beyond my daughter, Mrs. Reynolds. These students have shown tremendous courage in standing up against injustice. They've documented evidence of systematic discrimination in your classroom." Maya finally spoke up. "We have everything recorded, Dad. Not just how she treated me, but other students too. Past students have come forward as well." Mrs. Reynolds looked desperately around the room. "Dr. Johnson, please. I can explain. I've been teaching here for 20 years. My record—" "Your record is exactly what we need to examine," Dr. Johnson interrupted. "But as Maya's father, I will recuse myself from this investigation. The school board will review all evidence and make their decision." Sarah stepped forward and placed her phone on Dr. Johnson's desk. "Here's our documentation, sir. The whole class contributed." Mrs. Reynolds sat in stunned silence as more students came forward, placing phones and written statements on the desk. Months of evidence, all carefully collected and organized. "Mrs. Reynolds, please go home for the day," Dr. Johnson said firmly. "You'll be hearing from the school board tomorrow. Students, thank you for your courage. You may return to class now." As the students filed out, Maya lingered for a moment. Her father gave her a proud smile that maintained his professional demeanor. They had agreed early on to keep their relationship professional at school, and even now, they stuck to that agreement. Mrs. Reynolds remained seated, watching as Maya, the student she had bullied for months, the girl she had tried to break down, walked out of the office with her head held high, the principal's daughter all along. The truth was finally out, and nothing would be the same at Riverside High School again. The next morning, Riverside High School was buzzing with the news. Students whispered in hallways about how Mrs. Reynolds had been discriminating against the principal's daughter without knowing it. But for the school board, gathering in the conference room that afternoon, this was about much more than just Maya Johnson. Dr. Johnson sat outside the conference room while the board reviewed the evidence. As Maya's father, he had removed himself from the investigation. Inside, 5 school board members watched videos, read statements, and examined graded papers that showed a clear pattern of discrimination. Sarah and 3 other students had been called to testify. They sat nervously in the waiting area with Maya, who was scheduled to speak last. Through the glass walls, they could see Mrs. Reynolds sitting alone at one end of the conference table, looking much smaller without her usual confidence. Maya Johnson called Mrs. Martinez, the school board chairwoman. Maya stood up, squeezed Sarah's hand for support, and walked into the room. For the next 30 minutes, Maya presented her evidence calmly and clearly. She showed her documented timeline of events, shared recordings, and explained how Mrs. Reynolds' behavior had affected not just her, but other minority students over the years. We found 10 former students who had similar experiences in Mrs. Reynolds' class, Maya explained, placing their written statements on the table. They'd all felt powerless to speak up at the time. Mrs. Reynolds tried to interrupt. This is a misunderstanding. The videos show no misunderstanding, Board Member Thompson said firmly, replaying a clip of Mrs. Reynolds' outburst during the group presentation. Your words and actions are very clear. As Maya finished her presentation, something unexpected happened. The door opened, and 3 former students walked in. They had graduated years ago, but had come forward after hearing about the investigation. Mrs. Reynolds failed me in advanced English 5 years ago, said James Chen, now a college student. I had to transfer to another school because of her discrimination. I've kept all my graded papers to this day. Mrs. Reynolds' face grew pale as more evidence piled up. Years of discriminatory behavior, hidden behind her reputation as a strict teacher, were finally coming to light. The school board deliberated for 2 hours. When they emerged, their decision was unanimous. Mrs. Martinez addressed the waiting group. Based on overwhelming evidence, the board has placed Mrs. Reynolds on immediate administrative leave. She will undergo a mandatory 6-month intensive bias training program. Her return to teaching will depend on her completion of this program and a thorough evaluation. But the board wasn't finished. Mrs. Martinez continued. Furthermore, we are implementing new policies at Riverside High School. All teachers will receive regular cultural sensitivity training. A new anonymous reporting system will be created for students to report discrimination. Regular reviews of grading patterns will be conducted. A student-faculty diversity committee will be formed. Maya sat quietly as the decisions were announced. This was bigger than her now. It was about making sure no student would face what she and others had experienced. After the meeting, Dr. Johnson finally allowed himself to be a father rather than a principal. He hugged Maya tightly outside the conference room. I'm so proud of you, he whispered. You handled this with such grace and strength. Sarah and the other students surrounded Maya, celebrating their victory. But Maya noticed Mrs. Reynolds sitting alone in the conference room, staring at the stack of evidence. Maya made a decision. She walked back into the room, her father watching with surprise. Mrs. Reynolds, Maya said softly, I hope you'll use this opportunity to learn and grow. We all deserve a chance to be better. Mrs. Reynolds looked up, tears in her eyes. For the first time, she saw Maya, really saw her, not as a threat, not as someone who didn't belong, but as a strong young woman who had chosen justice over vengeance. As Maya walked out with her friends and father, she felt different. Standing up against discrimination wasn't just about pointing out what was wrong. It was about making things right for everyone who would come after. The halls of Riverside High School seemed brighter somehow. Change was coming, and Maya Johnson had helped make it happen. 6 months had passed since the day Mrs. Reynolds discovered Maya was the principal's daughter. Riverside High School had changed significantly during this time, becoming a model for other schools in the district. On a bright spring morning, Maya stood in front of the school's newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. The classroom was packed with students, teachers, and administrators. Looking at the eager faces before her, Maya could hardly believe how much had changed. Our first semester of changes has shown amazing results, Maya announced, pointing to the presentation screen behind her. Reports of discrimination have dropped by 80%, and our anonymous feedback system shows that students feel safer and more respected. Sarah, now the committee's vice president, stood beside Maya and added, We've started mentor programs, cultural awareness clubs, and monthly training sessions. But most importantly, students know their voices matter. The door opened quietly, and Mrs. Reynolds walked in. She looked different now, humbler, more thoughtful. After completing her mandatory bias training, she had voluntarily joined additional programs and asked to be part of the committee as a learning member. May I say something? Mrs. Reynolds asked softly. Maya nodded, stepping aside from the podium. The room fell silent as their former English teacher took her place at the front. 6 months ago, I was the problem this committee was created to solve, Mrs. Reynolds began, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't see my own prejudices. I thought being strict meant being right. Maya and her classmates didn't just expose my discrimination, they showed me a better way to teach. She turned to face Maya directly. You could have demanded my firing. Instead, you supported a path to learning and change. That taught me more than any training program could. Maya felt tears in her eyes but kept her composure. Around the room, students and teachers were nodding, some wiping away their own tears. After the meeting, Dr. Johnson gathered everyone in the school auditorium for a special announcement. The superintendent of schools was visiting with exciting news. Riverside High School's transformation has caught the attention of the entire district, the superintendent announced. Your new policies and programs will be implemented in all district schools next year. And it all started because one student chose to document unfairness rather than accept it. Maya sat between her parents in the front row, holding her mother's hand tightly. Behind her, she could hear Sarah and her other classmates cheering. The superintendent continued. We're also announcing the creation of the Maya Johnson Courage in Education Scholarship. Each year, it will be awarded to a student who shows exceptional commitment to making our schools more inclusive and fair. The auditorium erupted in applause. Maya felt overwhelmed as students and teachers stood to congratulate her, but her attention was drawn to a quiet scene at the back of the room. Mrs. Reynolds was talking to James Chen, the former student who had transferred because of her discrimination years ago. They were both crying, sharing what looked like a moment of healing and forgiveness. Later that afternoon, Maya's father found her sitting alone in his office, looking out the window at students leaving school. Penny for your thoughts? He asked, sitting beside her. Maya smiled. I was just thinking about that first day, when we decided to keep quiet about being father and daughter. We thought it would make things easier. And instead, it helped expose a problem that needed fixing. Dr. Johnson finished. Sometimes the hardest path leads to the most important changes. The scholarship was too much, Dad, Maya said, blushing. I didn't do this for recognition. No, he agreed. You did it because it was right. That's exactly why you deserve it. As they talked, Sarah poked her head in the door. Maya, the newspaper club wants to interview you about the new district policies. Maya looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. As she walked out with Sarah, she passed the English classroom where everything had started. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Reynolds setting up for tomorrow's class, a new banner hanging above her desk that read, Every student's voice matters. The story of the racist teacher and the principal's daughter had transformed into something bigger, a lesson about courage, change, and the power of standing up for what's right. Riverside High School would never be the same, and neither would any of the lives touched by what had happened within its walls. Sometimes the greatest changes start with one person brave enough to say, This is wrong. Maya Johnson had been that person, and her legacy would continue inspiring others for years to come. 5 years had passed since the events at Riverside High School. On a warm summer evening, Maya Johnson stood at a podium in the largest conference hall in the city. Now a college junior majoring in education law, she was the keynote speaker at the National Education Equality Conference. Hundreds of educators, administrators, and students from across the country filled the room. In the front row sat familiar faces, her proud parents, Sarah, now studying journalism, and surprisingly, Mrs. Reynolds, who had become an advocate for educational reform after her transformation. When I was 14, Maya began, I faced discrimination in my classroom, but what started as one teacher's prejudice led to a movement that changed thousands of lives. She gestured to the screen behind her, showing statistics from schools across the country. The Riverside model, as it's now called, has been implemented in over 500 schools nationwide. Reports of classroom discrimination have dropped by 70% in participating schools, but numbers don't tell the whole story. Maya clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of the first graduating class after the changes at Riverside. Every student in this photo went to college, every single one, because for the first time, they had teachers who believed in them, regardless of their race or background. In the audience, Mrs. Reynolds wiped away tears. She had retired from teaching 2 years ago, but now traveled the country sharing her story as a warning and a message of hope. Her testimony about her own transformation had become a powerful tool for change. Look around this room, Maya continued. I see students who started their own advocacy groups, teachers who reformed their grading systems, principals who created safe reporting channels. You all took our small story from Riverside and turned it into a national conversation. Sarah stood up and walked to the stage, joining Maya at the podium. As the editor of her college newspaper, she had written extensively about educational reform. Maya and I recently completed a 5-year follow-up study, Sarah announced. We interviewed over 1,000 students who experienced discrimination in schools. 80% said they stayed silent because they thought nothing would change. Today, we're here to tell you, everything can change. The presentation screen shifted to show video messages from students around the country. Each one shared how the Riverside model had affected their school. Maya recognized some of her former classmates among them, now teachers themselves, implementing the lessons they had learned. Dr. Johnson, now the superintendent of schools, beamed with pride as he watched his daughter. The small decision they had made years ago, to keep their relationship quiet, had sparked a chain reaction nobody could have predicted. After the conference, during the reception, Mrs. Reynolds approached Maya. Age had softened her features, and wisdom had replaced her former prejudice. Do you remember what you said to me that day in the conference room? She asked Maya, about hoping I would learn and grow. Maya nodded, accepting the cup of punch Mrs. Reynolds offered her. Those words changed my life, Mrs. Reynolds continued. I've spent 5 years trying to prove you right about people's capacity to change. Next month, I'm publishing a book about my journey from being part of the problem to part of the solution. I'd be honored to write the foreword, Maya offered, surprising her former teacher with a hug. Later that night, Maya sat in her hotel room, looking through old photos on her phone. She found one from her first day at Riverside High School, standing nervous and alone on the front steps. Next to it was a photo from today, hundreds of educators standing together, committed to making schools better for every student. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Check your email. The governor wants to implement the Riverside model statewide. Maya smiled, remembering the scared 14-year-old who had documented unfair treatment in her English class. That girl could never have imagined how far her courage would reach, how many lives would change, how many students would find their voices because she had found hers. Sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest places, a classroom, a conversation, a choice to stand up for what's right. As Maya prepared her response to the governor's office, she knew that somewhere, another student was finding the courage to speak up, to challenge injustice, to transform their own small corner of the world. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning.